Hello everybody, I'm Pontius Porcius and welcome back again to an unexpected aside. I'm not the biggest fan of the horror genre, however I do love specific entries inside of it, and there's nothing quite like a story of madness, macabre, and there's very few actors whose filmographies could ever quite reflect such an excellent array of examples to showcase this kind of story and its appeal as Vincent Price. And so tonight, allow me to take you on a journey to not only one of the best movies inside of Vincent Price's career, but also one of the best scenes inside of Vincent Price's career. House of Wax is a 1953 horror film. It is a film about an incredibly talented, yet not quite all there sculptor being pushed to the edge of his sanity by his avaricious business partner, whose modest financial gains through the ventures of the beauty-worshipping sculptor Jared pushes him to assault his partner and commit arson, destroying not only the museum for its insurance money, but also in destroying his former partner's beloved creations. After desperately fighting to save what he calls his children, the sculptor Jared eventually finds himself trapped inside of his burning studio, escaping into the night, burned, damaged, and more than just his limbs broken. He eventually tracks down his former business partner inside of his office and executes him with a garrote. About a year or so later, he approaches a wealthy investor and art critic that he was vetting to take over for his former business partner and opens up a new wax museum. However, instead of this one being dedicated to figures and subjects of beauty, this one is dedicated to sensationalized reports of violence and crime, where his museum hides a dark secret. To create the most authentic and convincing mannequins for his exhibits, Henry Jared stalks the night as a serial killer to execute not only people who wronged him, but also people who resemble the perpetrators and victims of notable gruesome moments in history, so that way he can preserve their bodies in wax and present them as mannequins inside of his museum. One of these people turns out to be a young lady named Kathy Gray, who shares a room in a boarding house with an innocent waif named Sue Allen. Sue walks into her room only to discover not only has her friend been strangled, but there's a mysterious man hiding in the shadows. Terrified, she runs from the man into the rain-soaked streets as he chases after her. A game of cat and mouse ensues as she ducks around corners, listening for his footsteps and attempting to escape, and the mysterious man is desperately looking for her. Eventually, she escapes into a house of not only a friend of hers, but also an aspiring sculptor. Several months pass, and some knowledge arrives to Miss Allen that the body of her friend was stolen the very same night that she was chased through the streets by the murderer. It also comes to her knowledge that her sculptor and potential boyfriend is taking her to a new wax museum celebrating grisly atrocities across history, so that way he can admire the handiwork of one of his idols, the sculptor extraordinaire Jared. While going there, Sue notices that the Joan of Arc statue that was remade from Jared's old museum looks remarkably like her friend. Obviously, this unsettles her, and Jared notices her visual discomfort and morbid curiosity in the statue. He approaches her, recognizing her visage, asking her what's frightened her, and she says that the mannequin looks a lot like the body of her friend that was stolen. He explains that he used photographs as a basis for the actual wax mold, and that is how he managed to instruct his apprentices to make such an authentic and real-looking mold. However, this explanation does not fully assuage Sue, who not only tells the police, but also encourages her friend the sculptor to look more into it. Her friend the sculptor is offered a position of apprenticeship and potential employment at Jared's new museum, not only as a means to try to control the knowledge that he has about what's going on at the museum, but also to get closer to Sue. For Jared has realized something. She is a spitting image of his single most perfect creation, his wax mannequin of Marie Antoinette. Desperate to try to bring about his magnum opus, he tries to lure Miss Allen into the museum, and Miss Allen, determined to figure out if her suspicions are true or not, goes to check the ears on the wax mannequin to see if they are, in point of fact, as pierced as her friend's was. She discovers that the mannequin, in point of fact, contains Kathy's body, and Jared reveals his secret to her. Eventually, the lieutenant of detectives, whose curiosity was piqued by Sue's report, investigates the employees of Jared's museum, discovers a former convict among them, and through interrogating the convict, discovers that the whole place is, in point of fact, a grisly carnival of serial murder by its own proprietor. and storming in with cops have to defeat Jared. So why am I talking about 1953's House of Wax? Well, I'd have to say if there's anything that I talk about, it's easily its opening scene, the most important scene inside of the entire film. It establishes the motivation for Henry. It showcases a much happier Jared, and passionately working on his greatest creations with his own hands, seeing the beauty that he could bring about into the world. Jared himself is a man who attests that he does not care much for the macabre or the gruesome, yet the opening pan into his museum showcases numerous scenes of violence, knives, and he himself, with delightful glee, showcases mostly tragedies from history, whether it be the assassination of Lincoln or even the burning of Joan of Arc, and he approaches all of these with an unsettling yet also disarming sense of humor, talking with his mannequins as if they were people, or as he calls them, his own children, and his pride and joy is none other than the executed herself, Marie Antoinette. He calls her his greatest creation, talking about her as if she's alive, hinting at the madness that could be unleashed should something terrible ever occur. And then you actually see that happen. The scene in which the first museum goes up in flames is a visual marvel of practical effects. It helps that each and every one of the mannequins has a sort of stiff powdered texture to it, like washed skin, giving them a uncanny yet not quite real resemblance to real people. Yet they just sit there with glassy eyes staring off everywhere. But then when the fire starts, you see the pallor from their skin melt away into smooth plaster. Their faces just drain of any personality or color. Their hair, which was so lovingly pressed in thread by Jared himself, melts into giant clumps, the only thing remaining pristine inside of their entire bodies being their eyes staring outward in silent screams of infernal pain. It's visual poetry that would make Poe green with jealousy, and the whole thing is magnificently captured and ultimately summarized by the destruction of Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette is the only mannequin inside of the entire Inferno that Jared even begins to start putting out, but even he himself has to escape, and we see Marie Antoinette fall before the whole thing explodes. You see Henry Jared's hopes and dreams go in a blazing inferno. Alas, there is no more Henry Jared, the passionate artiste. Now all that's replaced is the proprietor of the House of Wax, a shadowy, malformed figure, and a violent spirit matched only by his pure obsession. House of Wax is ultimately a classic example of how you can convey effective horror through visuals, atmosphere, and magnificently written character performances. Needless to say, the whole thing pretty much rests on Vincent Price's then and perpetually capable shoulders, but that's not to say that it doesn't have other great performances as well. Phyllis Kirk gives an amazing performance as Sue Allen, the leading lady, whose inquisitive nature and persistent demands that justice be served ultimately convince the police to investigate the matter to the point where they can actually save the day. House of Wax is ultimately an excellent and underknown horror film from bygone era that if you have any curiosity about what a horror film can achieve with next to nothing, I highly recommend checking it out. Pontius Porcius signing off. The thriller.